What we found is that elephant cortex is arranged in a fundamentally different way than the cortex of all other mammals. The neurons in the elephant cortex tend to spread their dendrites, their branches, out laterally over great distances, whereas those in, for example, primates, including humans, tend to be more compact and more vertically oriented. And so what we think is that these neurons in the elephant are sampling a very wide array of information. What that means in terms of function is hard to determine, but in talking with other elephant researchers, such as Joyce Poole, we agree that it might suggest that the elephants are a very contemplative animal. They think deeply about things. They're not in any particular hurry. Whereas primates, by comparison, seem to be designed with their cortical circuitry for very quick responses and quick decision making. Well, it's pure speculation, I think, but the large body mass of the elephant puts it in a rather unique position, as it doesn't have too many natural predators aside from humans. The cortical circuitry, which appears to be quite complex, would be important for things like having a cognitive map of its environment, remembering where food sources are and water sources are over long distances. And also, what we know from behavior at least, it's necessary for the very complex social world that they live in. The one thing we've learned from our comparative studies, and in particular from looking at the brains of elephants, is that there's more than one way to wire an intelligent brain. It doesn't have to follow the model or the template set by the human brain or the rodent brain, which are the brains that we've looked at the most in the field of neuroscience. So brains can be quite different, and yet you can still have a very intelligent organism. Within a given taxa, there's certainly a correlation between brain size and body size, which in turn would seem to correlate with cognitive ability, but that correlation is pretty weak because we know that even within a species, the correlation between brain size and intelligence is actually pretty small. In humans, for example, the typical brain would range between 1,000 grams and 2,000 grams, but the correlation with intelligence is very weak. So brain size is important and does go along with body size within a given taxa, but once you start going across different species, it becomes very muddled and unclear. It's certainly true that corvids and some parrots appear to have a cognitive ability that is similar to chimpanzees, so they can be quite intelligent. It isn't true that they don't have a cortex, but they have a cortex that is fundamentally different than what you see in mammals. And it was only in 2006 that researchers actually redid the nomenclature for an avian brain, giving it a completely new terminology. Before that, they had looked at the avian brain as being a rather deficient mammalian brain, and then they realized that that's just incorrect. The avian brain is just designed in a fundamentally different way. The cortex in an avian brain doesn't have the same layers as what you see in a mammal brain. The avian brain has more of what's called a nuclear organization, where you have cells in different groups that communicate with each other. In addition, birds have a very different evolutionary constraint on them, since most of them have the ability to fly. So their body weight is important, the size of their brain is important too, and so there are very tight restrictions on that. The evolutionary constraints for land mammals are quite different, and then for aquatic mammals are quite different as well, because they don't have to fight gravity quite as much. This is a difficult question, and I'm happy to reply with great authority that I really don't know what the answer is. I think to the extent that the architecture is similar across species, or say, for example, within a given taxa, the cognitive abilities are probably quite similar as well. We know that the amygdala, just to name one brain structure, is probably doing essentially the same thing in a rat or a dog or a human, even though it might be slightly different, but the functions are probably quite similar and conserved through evolution. To the extent that there might be morphological differences, then maybe there is a difference in kind in terms of cognition, but that's really hard to specify. I think the bottom line would be that humans have a great deal more in common with non-human animals, both in terms of brain architecture and brain physiology and brain function than we typically would like to admit. Our most recent research focused on looking at what are called gigantopyramidal cells, or Betz cells, in a variety of species. These are large neurons in the motor cortex of animals. We've known about these for over 100 years, but there's still a lot we don't know, and they've never really been looked at in a comparative perspective before. So we looked at over 20 different species to see what these neurons looked like, and we actually traced these neurons, which had never been traced before either. And what we found is in the large felids, so tigers, lions, leopards, these neurons were disproportionately larger than they were in other species, including things like humans, baboons, wildebeest, zebras, just very large in the large cats. And we think that has to do with both the characteristics of their hunting behavior, because these cats, like along the Panthera lineage in particular, like to hunt by pouncing on prey that is larger than them. And that requires a huge amount of coordination of many groups of muscles all at the same time. So we think their hunting behavior might be one explanation for these very large gigantopyramidal cells. The other explanation we think might have to do with the muscle fiber types in these animals. Large felids have a particular kind of muscle fiber, at least proportionately, in greater abundance than you find in humans, for example. So we think the interaction between the musculoskeletal and nervous system over time may have caused these pyramidal cells, these gigantopyramidal cells, to be much larger in the cats. I think the short answer is that captivity, especially for larger animals, is really a form of what we would call environmental enrichment. And there's been over 60 years of research looking into this, looking at how the environment affects the brain. And the short story is that an impoverished environment, which is what I think you get in captivity, has really detrimental effects on all aspects of the brain, from the morphology of cells all the way down to the messenger RNA level. So animals held in captivity, you would expect that they would show effects of environmental enrichment. In terms of morphology, their dendrites will be shorter. The capillaries will not be able to carry as great of a blood supply. The cells won't have as many connections. They won't process information as efficiently as in an enriched animal. So I'm not sure there's any form of captivity that isn't in some way impoverishing for the animal. I'm not sure there is consensus among scientists for much of anything, but I do think people who study animals, the ideas are moving in the direction of acknowledging that the mental lives of non-human animals, for the most part, are very similar to the mental lives of humans. And I think it's difficult for humans to acknowledge this because as a species, we have put ourselves on center stage. We're very anthropocentric in our thinking. And we have attempted throughout history to separate ourselves from non-human animals. So it puts us in a rather uneasy position to admit that non-human animals might be conscious, they might have emotions, they might feel pain, where the neural information suggests that all of those things are true. It may not be exactly the same. Their experiences may not be exactly the same as humans, but they're probably very similar. The sad part is, of course, as humans, we're aware that other humans are conscious. We're aware that other humans have emotions, that other humans are frustrated and feel pain, and we tend not to treat other humans very well sometimes either. So it isn't clear, even knowing that non-human animals feel these things and can suffer, whether we as a species will treat them very well anyway. It's just not clear yet. We're continuing to do our comparative work, looking for new species to study, and which is not hard to do because about 80% of all neuroscience research has focused on primates and on rodents. We've done over 20 species so far that haven't been looked at before, but there's a lot more species out there that nobody's looked at either. So it's always fun to stay in the cortex of a species that has never been looked at and to see what's there and see what's unique about it. I think those who observe animals in their natural habitats in particular deserve a lot of credit for raising our awareness of what these animals can do, what their cognitive abilities are, what their communicative abilities are. Neuroscientists, of course, are approaching things from a different perspective, looking at different aspects of the brain, and a lot of research is going on in a lot of different areas there. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and we're learning that even animals that seem relatively simple at first, say a honeybee, in the end have a very complex nervous system and a very complex behavioral repertoire. And over time, hopefully, the ethologists and the neuroscientists can work together to put together some of these pieces so that we can understand these animals more completely.